Good afternoon and welcome to this 10-10 webinar for the top 5 reasons why Agile failed and how to avoid them. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Stephen Osman. I'm one of the principal consultants at 10-10, aligned to our strategy workforce, so generally involved with strategic test reviews, test strategy definition, and providing strategic consultancy on Agile best practice. So before I go into detail about some of the challenges around the Agile methodology, I wanted to do a quick refresher on what the Agile methodology was. I'm not going to labour these slides too much, as I'm assuming that most people who are attending this are aware of the Agile principles, but it's a iterative approach to software delivery. More traditional methods like the Waterfall methodology tended not to deliver solutions as quickly and efficiently as possible and could take many months or even years for solutions to be delivered and first seen by the stakeholders who requested them from the start. With a need for more flexible and greater feedback and speed to market, the Agile methodology has become the new norm for many projects with a lot of our clients. So you see from the diagram on the screen there's a number of key meetings or key processes that happen in a typical Agile sprint. An Agile sprint will normally start off with a sprint planning meeting where the backlog is reviewed and the sprint backlog is confirmed. Essentially, this is a meeting to go through what's been agreed as the requirements for the product, to look at what can be achieved in terms of a single sprint, typically a 2-week length sprint. Based on estimates and capacity, the team will agree a number of stories to be accepted into that sprint. And then over the course of the sprint, they will then work on incrementing that as a working increment of software. At the end of the 2 weeks, the team will come together in terms of a review. They'll provide a show and tell of what has been delivered over the course of that sprint, and also provide a team retrospective as well of what went well, what didn't go so well, and what could be improved in future sprints. It's worth noting that the Agile methodology is meant to be flexible. Even if the sprint has completed to a number of user stories during that 2 weeks, if it doesn't deliver against all those user stories, it shouldn't be considered a negative thing. In the show and tell meetings, the team should be transparent and demo the stories that have been delivered and give a little bit of rationale on why some of the stories weren't delivered. That could be due to increased complexity, etc., etc. There's a number of major roles within the Agile teams. It's typically the product owner being the one who owns the delivery of that product and is a representative of the business. You've got the ScrumMaster, who makes sure that the team are involved and running against the core Agile principles. The development team, and this includes everyone from BAs, dev and test, and also the end users as well. So any people from the business which might be interested in the product and will be involved in the show and tell meetings at the end. So let's get into the purpose of this presentation itself, looking at some of the reasons of why Agile can fail. A lot of the time we meet with clients and they talk about how they recently tried to move away from the Waterfall methodology, trying to adopt more Agile principles, but aren't necessarily seeing the benefits that you should see for an Agile project. They're potentially seeing that they are running sprints, they're having daily stand-ups, but they're not getting the increments of code that they would expect. And they're not getting the collaboration between the team and the business that you would expect in an Agile project. We do see this time and time again, and we've done a number of reviews with clients of their Agile delivery, and we've seen some repetition in terms of the pitfalls and challenges that have been experienced. These are split into 5 key areas, one being around team and company culture, one being reporting and governance, one being around Scrum slave, not Scrum master, one being around coverage concerns, and one being around complex requirements. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to expand on each of these challenges and also give a little bit of advice on how these can be avoided on your projects. So covering our first challenge, we look at team structure and company culture. Obviously, adopting Agile requires a significant shift in culture from a business, especially when you're moving away from your more traditional methodologies like Waterfall. We've seen occasions where some stakeholders, especially senior management, have built a career out of the Waterfall methodology and are not necessarily completely comfortable with that move to Agile and don't necessarily trust it. Large enterprises often include big teams, and they may consist of remote members in remote locations as well. I've worked on a number of projects where teams are trying to implement Agile, but they've got teams which are based in the UK, the US, and India. And with a key element of Agile being for close communication and collaboration, this can often be seen as a bit of a challenge. How can you run a successful Agile project where you've got team based in different time zones and different projects? Because of this, or what we've seen in terms of a challenge, the remote workers or functions don't necessarily receive the adequate communications that should be in place, and that breaks down the lines of communication that can be seen as one of the reasons why Agile fails. So tips on how you can avoid this challenge, and a lot of this links to the core fundamentals of the Agile methodology, but the first and probably most important is making sure you've got the management buy-in from your key sort of stakeholders and leadership. If they need to be educated and brought into the Agile ways of working, that should be discussed with them up front, and expectations in terms of what they can expect in terms of reporting, progress updates, and just the way the team are going to work should be agreed up front with them. Stand-ups and retrospectives are really, really important, as that forges a culture of communication, and that's really important for remote teams. Just because you're placed in different locations doesn't mean that regular calls, stand-ups, show and tells, retrospectives, all those kind of things. We live in an age now where you haven't got to be sat with each other necessarily. You can use webinars and web conferences to make sure that your team are still communicating regularly. You just need to make sure that it's put in place, and then there is discipline around those meetings being run. You should select a collaborative Agile management tool that clearly allows collaboration for the whole team. What I've seen doesn't work is where you've got different teams based over different locations, and they're doing or working with an offline tool such as Excel, and they then need to send the Scrum Master or a test lead updates on their progress on a daily basis, and then the Scrum Master has to go through the painful process of collating all of these into a master sheet. When you've got an Agile management tool in things like Visual Studio Microsoft Solutions or Jira, that can allow multiple members within the team to log into those tools, provide updates in real time, which generates your status reporting, allows the whole process to be a lot cleaner, reduce the risk of mistakes, and allow the whole team to collaborate together. Whilst you mentioned around teams working remotely, if there is ever an opportunity for businesses to be sat together, so say you've got a situation where you're working within the same building, but traditionally you've had the dev team on one floor, the test team on another floor, the design team on another floor. If you've got a situation like that, there is no reason why you can't encourage them to be sat next to each other and create team silo desks, as well as that closer location does allow better communication and better collaboration. So going on to our second pitfall, we look at reporting and governance. Agile is rightfully seen as being a flexible type of software methodology, and there's often a bit of a miscommunication and confusion of how development progress is being communicated by senior management. There's sometimes a tendency within Agile projects for Scrum Master just to say, no, there isn't any documentation, but there is always a requirement for senior leadership or senior management and stakeholders to be able to communicate what the progress from those projects are, and that can lead to a little bit of I guess difficulty between those two stakeholders. It's therefore important that you do still need to be transparent with appropriate levels of reporting and governance in place, and linking back to what I said at the start around making sure you bring your stakeholders into the way which you're going to be working. You agree up front the type of reporting that you're going to send out, the regularity that you're going to be sending out, whether it's sent out on a sprint by sprint basis, a day by day basis, a week by week basis. But again, everyone is comfortable with the expectations, and everyone should feel like they're working towards a common goal together. So to expand on how the challenges around reporting and governances can be avoided, as said, you should agree the reporting framework and governance process with all team members within the Agile project up front. Ensure that you've got a done criteria agreed and use that as a benchmark to assess your completeness. The done criteria essentially explains as a project everything which needs to be completed within a user story to class it as being done. So that's going to include things like making sure that your user stories are defined, that devs being completed, that unit testing is being conducted, release notes have been shared, any training documentation has been uploaded to a wiki page, obviously that testing has been completed, and that there's no sort of critical or high defects preventing that story from being closed. Make sure that you do the show and tells and you run that at the end of every sprint. Again, that gives an opportunity to validate the requirements and assumption with those key stakeholders. If they're not receiving a daily status update of this is the user stories and this is what's being completed, the show and tell is the key meeting where they can see what's been delivered during that sprint. And also make sure that all team members are included in your retrospective meetings. Our third challenge refers around the concept of Scrum slave rather than Scrum Master. The whole role of the Scrum Master, as said at the start, is to serve the team. That involves removing impediments, coaching them on the Agile way of working, and also sort of removing any of the noise or challenges that the team would feel or experience from stakeholder, and effectively sheltering that dev team. On some projects, we see that Scrum Masters can be micromanagers of all activities, but that type of leadership we see damages team morale and shows a lack of trust that can prevent the team from achieving their goals. The Scrum Master isn't a project manager or a test manager or a dev manager. They don't necessarily need to know every single thing which a team is doing at any one time. What they need to make sure the team is doing is working together to get to the end goal. There's also the opposite scenario, which we also see that the Scrum Master becomes completely disengaged with the team. They don't attend or run the required meetings, and that then leaves the team effectively being udderless and being unaware of what their objectives for that sprint is. So how do I overcome these pitfalls? The key one, and guess an obvious one, is to make sure that your Scrum Master has the correct training and personality. The latter point there is probably key. Being a Scrum Master does need to have a certain type of personality. Not every single person can be a Scrum Master. They need to be good at communicating, at collaborating, and be confident in conveying messages, sometimes awkward ones, to the senior leadership team. But also for your Scrum Master, you need to make sure that they trust and empower not only themselves, but also with the rest of the team as well. So to make sure that they're not sort of taking any of their effort or responsibility away from the actual team members themselves. So again, agreeing, define roles and responsibilities within your team before you get started, again, gives that whole team ethos right from the start of the project. Our fourth pitfall focuses around coverage concerns. So in Agile delivery, functionality is typically delivered in short bursts and can sometimes lead to questions around test coverage. The role of the tested changes, so the required skill to fulfill this role equally changes. We either do testing iteratively over features that are not yet fully completed. You don't necessarily have the benefit that you would do in a waterfall product where you've got a signed off functional design document with all the requirements being understood up front. Constant iterative changes can also lead to increased chance of regression issues, and that means that there needs to be more focus on regression testing to make sure that already built features keep on working. So how to avoid issues around coverage concerns? So make sure to divide work based on user stories with detailed acceptance criteria in a consistent format. Make sure that you adopt a risk-based test coverage strategy and make sure that's agreed with the product owner up front. This allows you to prioritize your most important elements first, as defined by the users or sponsors, where the greatest risk implies more and better testing is needed. And as mentioned previously, make sure that you are maintaining and developing a regression test suite over the course of a sprint. Ideally, that's within a automation framework, but if it does need to be executed manually, make sure that from a test standpoint, that you're considering that up front when you look at your capacity for an upcoming sprint. If your regression testing by the 5th or 6th sprint is taking half a day to run, you need to make sure that your capacity reflects that and you've got half a day less to accept new user stories into your sprint. Our 5th and final challenge or regular failure that we see around Agile is the issue where requirements are very complex. Sometimes you have very detailed and difficult requirements, especially on the more complex projects where there are multiple integration points or considerations around compatibility. When dealing with complex requirements, it's important that the development team, along with the Scrum Master, make sure they plan the solution as best as possible, and make sure that they fully understand those complex requirements and understand whether they can be broken into smaller user stories, iterated over time. Also, developers sometimes change big features late on within a project, and whilst the developers may understand the implications of this change, the impact to a product or end user might be high, especially if that change is unexpected. So a couple of tips on how this can be avoided. The key one being that if a functional or solution is blocked or doesn't look to be working, or it's an incomplete user story or requirement, then escalate this to your Scrum Master and make sure a solution has been agreed with the product owner. Don't ever accept user stories into your sprint if they're incomplete, as that's going to cause issues in terms of developing it, in terms of how you can test it. So please be aware of that. And ensure that complex requirements are broken down into deliverable chunks. So when you go into your sprint planning meeting, when you start doing your estimating, if you're using, for example, the Fibonacci sequencing, and you find that a user story is coming in at an estimate of 12 or more, it would probably be worthwhile looking at that user story and working out, can that user story, which is a 12, be split into 2 user stories, which are 2 6s? And what happens quite a lot in sprints is that there's a number of high complex user stories with a 12 or 15 estimate. What ends up happening is that gets accepted into a sprint due to its complexity that sometimes takes 2 or sometimes 3 sprints to actually deliver. That kind of defeats the object of Agile a little bit. It demotivates the team a little bit as well, because they're not delivering what they're set out to do. So if they can deliver a user story in a slightly reduced level of effort, so yeah, as I said, two smaller user stories, they're able to allow shippable products and allow demos at the end of each sprint as well. So we hope you've enjoyed this session and you've taken a number of things away from this. Naturally, we'd love to hear about some of the challenges which you've maybe faced on Agile projects, and in addition to what we've said here, any changes that you've put in place which has helped overcome those challenges. The key takeaways that we'd like to give you for this session is to make sure that training is key, to make sure that the whole team is trained in the Agile way of working, and make sure they're comfortable operating in that space. Make sure your team are empowered, that they know what they're doing, but you trust them to do their jobs. Make sure that you communicate during every stage of the Agile journey. That's the key fundamental of Agile and a key fundamental principle. So during the whole process from start to finish, it should be regular communication. Make sure the process is understood. Agile is a defined methodology, but it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It does need to sometimes be tweaked depending on stakeholders, project, type of work that you're doing. But any tweaks that you do make sure that's defined and understood and signed off from all stakeholders up front. And again, linked to communicated, make sure that your team collaborates and make sure that they share assets, they share things during show and tell, they share what went well during retrospectives, what could be improved during retrospectives, and make sure that that continuous improvement ethos is ingrained right from the start of the project. So thank you, everyone. And any questions, my email is at the end of this presentation, so please do reach out to me.